So we got a bunch of folks, so we'll just go ahead and get started. And folks who are late will miss the introductions, but hopefully not much more. My name is Greg. Some of you on here I have not met before, which is awesome. And we are going to be recording this. It will be available afterwards. So beware and rest assured. And also we'll be taking notes thanks to John Higgins, our note taker, our volunteer note taker, in the document that I shared in the chat bar. I think everybody should still be able to see that even if you joined after I sent it. Please just jump in there and list your name in the attendees section. And cool, so this is an open referral assembly. We do these semi-regularly when there's important cool stuff to talk about. And this week we will be reviewing Kinlane's work on the Human Services Data API specification. We'll also be talking a little bit about some tools that have emerged from the network. Folks have been building tools to help people work with data in this format. And we'll have a little bit of time to actually talk at a high level about the different types of users for whom we are designing. And this is specifically users for whom we are designing this set of API protocols. So linked in the notes is a document where we keep track of the open referral sort of types of use that we recognize across the initiative. We're going to be burrowing down and say, who are the types of people who are going to be actually using these protocols? And we need to get that clear in our heads so that we can effectively evaluate whether our design is meeting our goals. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the issues that Kin has been addressing in this sort of first or second version of the API specification, and fielding any questions or concerns that might come up. Assuming things look generally pretty clear, we're going to call this the setting of version 1.1, and also start prioritizing the agenda for 1.2. And after, I'm hoping to wrap us up a little bit after the hour on that formal discussion. We're going to try to take some time towards the end of the second hour. This is totally optional. Y'all don't have to stay, this whole time. But we're going to be talking about some frontier issues. These are sort of new elements of the spec that have come up as people starting to do implementations. Issues such as how to handle updates and approval mechanisms and feedback loops, identifiers. These aren't things that have been fully articulated yet, and we're going to start thinking about them and might even start assessing whether they should be included in the final iteration of this round of specification development, or whether we just put them on the roadmap for the next generation and start figuring out what it is that we want to learn about those new dimensions in the specification. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and actually step back and let us do introductions. And then we'll dive into the process so far. So I'll just go down, I'll call folks out, let's see, just in order of their appearance on my screen. Chris, go ahead and tell us who you are.
Okay, guys, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Hi, my name is Chris Spiliotopoulos, or you can just call me Chris from Greece, because I'm from Greece, and my last name is too difficult for everybody to replicate. So I found out about this project through the work of Kinlane, and my job title is software architect. So I'm a very technical guy, and I found the whole effort of great significance and importance, and I hope that I could, just put my work to good use and help you out with this collaborative effort in order to move things forward. So today, I don't think I'll I have anything significant regarding the API specification to contribute or talk about, but I'd rather stand back and listen to all the rest of you. But at the same time, during the second part of the discussion, maybe I could give you some information regarding some work I've been doing for the last month with regards to open source tooling.
Cool. Let's see. Ken, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey there, I'm Ken Lane. I'm API Evangelist. I'm the technical lead on the specification, helping Greg sort through all the technical details of what's going on.
And Benj?
Hey folks, this is Benj Cam from Health Leads. We are deeply interested in the work of resource standards, both because of our work with Health Leads Reach, which is a case management, social needs case management, and resource database search for use particularly in the health space, and I'm director of product for that. I think we also really deeply believe in the vision of breaking down some of the silos and kind of moving from, right now so much energy is spent on kind of segmented and siloed resource database management, and that just seems a shame, kind of contra to our organization's mission. So excited to be part of this conversation, and we are in the middle of spinning up a few pilots with other folks on this call, which we are planning to be fully open referral based. So I'm really excited for it.
Cool. Thank you. Shelby.
Hey everybody. I'm Shelby Switzer. I lead our APIs and integrations at Healthify in the same space as Health Leads, and I am also incredibly stoked about breaking down silos, and that's why I'm here, as well as a love for APIs.
Tim Escher?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I'm on the phone, not on the Zoom. Okay, I'm based in the Anchorage, Alaska area, and I'm working with a couple of agencies up here that are looking for new client referral systems. One of them, the group that runs our 2.1 system up here, and I got introduced to Open Referral through Brendan Babb, who's does a lot of work with Code for America and runs our Code for Anchorage Brigade up here. Yes, I'm just trying to learn at this point. I don't know much about it, and that's mostly I'm going to be listening.
Cool. Tim, there's a lot of context that we're probably not going to be getting into here. This will be a fairly technical conversation, so I'm happy to follow up with you afterwards.
Sounds great.
Let's see, who else? John McConnell?
Yes, it's John McConnell. I'm working with the United Way of Dane County's 2.1. We're currently implementing a version of an API through our new vendor, VisionLink. We have a little bit of sort of end user experience, but I'm really interested to see how this project is going forward and can make everything smoother and better for everybody. Great, thank you. John Higgins.
Hello, everybody. From Benetech, which is in Palo Alto, California. We've been working with Greg for a while now in the open referral space, and we currently are having kind of two pilot projects, one of which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, working with the local 2.1, several counties, around helping them understand some of the value prop for open referral, and then working in Florida with legal server vendor, which Xander's also on the call, so I'll maybe let him speak to more of that, but working to break down silos between legal service providers in mid-Florida.
And Andrew Nicklin. Andrew, by the way, has lent us this Zoom feature, so thank you very much, Andrew. He's still on mute. I'll give him a moment. Edafe?
Hi, I'm Idafi Onaheim. I'm with the Open Data Services Cooperative. We're providing technical support and advice on the standard. For this call, I've been doing a quick review of the API, and I'll be sharing some of my findings with the group.
And Ubel, is that Mike? Mr. Ubel?
Yep, that's me.
All right.
I've been away for a while. I was active, I don't know, 2 years ago maybe. Anyway, I just thought I'd check and see what's going on. I work a lot with Open Oakland, and a nonprofit that I'm involved in may finally actually be a consumer of such data. So I'm sort of interested to see what's going on and just catch up a bit. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And let's see, we have a Matt.
Yes, Matt with RTM Designs.
Awesome. Matt Pierce?
Peace, yes, Matt Peace.
All right, welcome, Matt. And Xander?
Yeah, I'm Xander. I'm a project manager at Legal Server, working with Benetech and Open Referral on a project in Florida to help network their civil legal service agencies together to help increase referral accuracy. So excited, using obviously Open Referral to do that as the main driver. So excited to be here and really listening in and kind of getting my footing on the tech specs. I'm a philosophy major and not a developer, so it's been really exciting to see everything.
Great. Neil, if you haven't yet been able to get audio, just send me a text or something and I'll troubleshoot. Otherwise, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. Hi. No, I think I have audio, but it means I went to a machine without a camera, so no more video. Good day. I'm Neil McKechnie, the CTO of iCarol, which is a software platform. In this world, I would say it's an INR software platform, but we also serve more broadly nonprofit helplines around the world.
Great. And Kate Lambacker?
Hello, Kate Lambacker. I am the software architect of a project called OpenSeoc, which is an open source resource database for information and referral and volunteer matching. And I'm mainly here because we have been doing data exchange between systems for about, I don't know, more than a decade, and I am very interested to see if we can start matching up some of our use cases to standardize maybe on something that is not, something new we invent every time we run into a new system to do exchange with. So yeah, this is a major area of interest for me, so happy to be here.
Awesome. We've got a couple folks on the phone. Who hasn't introduced themselves yet? Go ahead. Maybe has everybody gone?
Hi, this is Dan Darnell. I'm a project manager at Mediware. Just becoming familiar with Open API, hoping to sit back and learn.
Awesome. Welcome. Cool. All right. If anybody else is on this call, I think this is the most we've ever had on an assembly, which is awesome. Anybody else speak now? Otherwise, we'll dive into the agenda. All right. So again, we have a Google Doc where we've been taking notes on all of these assemblies. This is the top one on page 2. And you'll see the agenda. If you don't have the Google Doc, you can check the chat column or check the calendar item for the link. So I'm going to kick it to Kinlain in just a second. First, just for some deeper context, for those who are new or still piecing together this complexity, Open Referral developed the Human Services Data Standard in 2015. We came out with version 1.0. That was a schema. Vocabulary for describing organizations, the services that they provide, and the locations that they're at. We updated that schema this year with the help of the Open Data Services Cooperative. And this topic we're discussing right now is building on that work to develop an API specification. So these are protocols for working with this data, for moving this data around when it's in the format of the Human Services Data Specification. So with that context as the background, I'm going to share this with Kin. I'm going to kick this to Kin and have him talk a little bit about the process that we've been going through so far. And also, since this is a big group, if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat column over here on the right, or in the document, and I will try to stack those questions for us to address as we go. Okay, Kin, go ahead. Tell us about the work you've been doing so far, a high-level overview.
Sure. So how long do you want me to go here as far as what do you got slated?
We'll get into the nitty gritty after we talk a little bit about the types of users that we're designing for. Just give us a sense of the path to this point
Sure.
and how you've been sort of developing this model.
Sure. So I've just been, building on the great work of what Greg's doing, but also on the going from version 1.0 to 1.1 of the schema specification. So really trying to help take the schema specification and evolve it simultaneously as an API. And my work is very much rooted in what API we've had before. So we consider version 1 of the Human Services Data API to be the Ohana implementation, which was created as part of several earlier projects and in use by several implementations. So my work is very much taking that API definition as a version 1, taking version 1.1 of the schema and trying to create an acceptable version 1.1 of the API that doesn't move too far down the road, but gets us, far enough down the road that that we can feel comfortable we're moving the spec forward, but setting the table for what's next. And really that conversation opened up, I would consider, a floodgate of feedback and thoughts. And that's what this conversation is trying to help articulate what's on the table as far as here's our 1.1 draft. And this is I use what's called Open API, which I'll talk about a little bit more, to kind of define what that specification looks like, what it acts like, how it behaves. And we're also moving forward a prototype demo that helps kind of, share that load as far as articulating what's going on. But once we dive into the details, I'll step through each of the items that are on the table right now before we close up the 1.1 draft. And then we'll talk about how, what's going to be put on the table for 1.2.
Cool. So I'm going to also set some more context here. We'll create a little bit of room for discussion, although I'm mostly just going to get a sort of survey of folks' feedback on this framework, because this could go really deep. I want to talk a little bit about how we're understanding the different types of users for whom we're designing. There is a document linked in the notes. We started developing this document early in the Open Referral Initiative. This lays out our understanding of the universe of users. The document starts describing the universe of users for community resource directory data. That's people who are seeking help, people who are providing help, people who are conducting research and analysis of the allocation of resources on a sort of macro level, and then people who are actually working with this data administrators. This is at a very high level, who does the Open Referral Initiative aim to help? Now, here we're scoping in a little bit, we're digging in on a more granular level. We're developing API protocols, and we want to be specific about the types of users for those protocols. So this is a step removed from the question of what do people who are seeking help need, even though that is our primary question, right? But we filter this conversation through that lens, but right now we're considering what is needed by the people who are actually working with this data whether it's to do research or to develop applications or to actually edit this data, and so on. And we have a few different frameworks that I think we're going to continue to try to hone as we evaluate, as we develop the specification and evaluate its success. So if you look to page, this is page 5 of the user personas document. We've been sort of honing this and maybe tweaking it through every one of these conversations. And I'm hoping to actually come out with a much more solidified version by the next assembly. So I'm eager to get your feedback. Right now we have a set of types of users. Oh yeah, I'm going to set this so that if you can't make comments, I'm going to change it right now so that you can make comments. Go ahead and refresh if you weren't able to make comments before, and now you should be able to. So we have a set of types of use: someone doing research, someone building an application, somebody who's editing data, like checking the accuracy of information, expanding data, removing data. And then we also identified, and this is something that Benetech and Legal Server are working on, so maybe they could speak a little bit to it, the type of use where an organization actually wants to update their own information. And it's not entirely clear to me whether that's actually a user of an API. So that's a little bit of an open question. Is that someone we're thinking about in the design of these protocols specifically? We've also just today gotten a set of example use cases from Kate. I think it's a very interesting framework. I want to better understand, are these use cases really distinct types of people, or are these just examples of types of use within those persona? And I think, so I'll just go ahead and say, I think this all of these frameworks can be crystallized, possibly merged, and I want to get a sense from you all. If you have a taxonomy in your head, I want to hear about it. We want to collect examples, comments, and so on. This is going to be an ongoing process. We're not going to figure it all out on this call, but I do want to get your feedback on these frameworks and see if there's something here that you think can be reframed, or if there's something that we're missing, a kind of use that's really important that doesn't fall within one of these categories. I want to hear it. So we'll just take a few minutes to get folks' feedback on these frameworks. If anybody has questions, you can go ahead, or if people start talking all at once, I'm gonna make a stack.
This is Kate. I'm gonna unmute myself here. I'm quite happy to explain where I'm coming from with the roles that I listed, which is a really it's a major tangent from the way that you're describing the roles in the rest of the document. But what is maybe unexpected is that some of the user roles you mentioned, like say someone developing an application, that's way more fungible in the real world than you would think. Like I've had people come to me and tell me that they want to develop an application, and then when I dug in with them what they wanted, they actually did not. That's not what their actual end goal was. And there was another solution that ended up happening that wasn't them building an application. So I think that there's a use case behind all of the use cases, if you know what I mean. And so I've tried to take an approach that represents actual real world cases that we've had, and this is probably numbering, 50 at least by now that I've had with our system of people approaching us wanting to do something with my client's data, and how we ended up dealing with the end product. And I would say there's a good percentage of the time where they come in thinking that they want something, and it does go totally off in a different direction, because in the end they had one of these specific things in mind, or a combination. Like, it was important to them that it was the brand thing, that it looked like their own thing. They didn't actually care if they had a copy of the data. They didn't actually want to build their own application. That wasn't the important thing to them. The important thing to them was the branding, or the important thing to them was the ability to do their own categories, or the important thing to them was that they have to keep this particular licensing information. Or, you know, if you dug in a little bit deeper, their requirement was always something very specific along those lines, of those roles that I have framed it as. So I think there's huge crossover between the use cases that you've defined and the ones that I've defined. It's not a one-to-one. Like, you could take a researcher and end up fitting them. They mostly would fall in the first one, but it depends a little more deeply on what their goal is and how they care about the information. There's a huge difference, for example, between someone who needs the data once and someone who needs the data updated, and someone who needs the data as is, or someone who needs to add to that data, or someone who needs to combine it within existing sets. Some people come in with a system already, and their goal is absolutely to work with their system, and some people might think they have to have a system, and so they come in saying, I want to integrate into my system, but that's not actually what their need is. So that's where I'm coming in sort of my perspective of the way that I'm choosing to describe the use cases.
Super helpful feedback, Kate, and really interesting stuff. Do other folks have experience with people who need to access data? You're trying to serve them up via API, or at least you have a partnership in mind that falls within, that does not fall within one of these categories? And or do you have a typology in your head that you might want to share with us as we wrap our heads around how do we effectively sort of crystallize this matrix of possible uses and users?
Real quick, I would like to kind of shift the landscape just a little bit in the similar way that she just did. Is from my experience as API evangelist, focusing on application programming interfaces, when people come and say they want to develop an application, the most common notion is someone wants to build a web or mobile application. But if you actually look at it, people just want to apply the data. That's an application. They just want to apply it in some way. So I find it helps to assist folks in unshackling themselves from those notions of web or mobile, because simply getting a subset of data into a spreadsheet is a valid application. So developing applications is a pretty wide landscape these days.
Very helpful clarification. Other folks? We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it will be, especially as we have to make decisions about trade-offs. Having one of a framework like this that we can all point to is going to be pretty important as things get hairy. So I know I have some time to think about after this the framework that Kate's brought here and see if we can hash out different versions. But I want to collect other ideas and other feedback if folks have it.
This is Ben. I just want to affirm, Kate, this is a really helpful taxonomy. I think, as you said, very different from the list above. And I think the list above is important in keeping a user-centered focus and make sure what we're proposing ultimately meets the needs of the people who need it. But I felt like there's a bit of a disconnect between those user roles and the technical capabilities of an API, and I think you've done a really nice job of starting to lay out like what types of integrations does the API need to drive. So thanks for moving us in that direction.
Cool. Well, there's a lot to think about here. We can also return to this if something comes up in the conversation as we move forward. But I think we can move on and actually talk a little bit about, before we get into the spec, with this in mind, before Ken, we start hearing from you about some of the specific issues, I do want to point to a set of tools that have come out that different volunteers have made And just to give us a frame of reference of how people are already starting to use this specification, as well as, and I think it'll also give us a sense of what is it that the folks on this call are going to need to most effectively work with to apply the specification. So we have a few that I want to highlight. Chris, for example, developed the Open Referral toolkit, Playground. And we also had Devin, who's not on this call, developed an Airtable framework. And Kin, maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the tooling that you've developed, both the portal and actually, let's start with Kin. Kin, can you link to us the portal and talk a little bit about the tooling you've built around the spec itself before we get into the issues? And then I'll kick it to Chris.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't move any API definition forward without actually using it and applying it. I'm pasting in the chat window the prototype that I've built, which is a PHP MySQL classic LAMP stack running on a Amazon Web Services EC2 instance. So it's a pretty, it uses the Slim PHP framework for the API. But so it's a live portal. It's not perfect. It's a prototype. So it's still trying to keep it in sync with the spec. But it's the portal itself around the API runs on GitHub, is using the Bootstrap, Twitter Bootstrap template, which is meant to allow people to customize it in any way they want. But the portal has is a checklist in itself of how you can launch a portal around an API. We haven't gotten to that portion of the guidance, but as what I do in my regular day job as API evangelist is help study how people deploy APIs and what are the consistent building blocks in use around an API that help developers be more successful in their applications. So the portal itself has all the essential building blocks. It has documentation, it has some code samples, it has support elements, it has a blog. So the portal runs on GitHub. It can be forked by anyone. It's not well documented yet, but once I enter the phase where we're moving more into kind of operating your API guidance, I'll document it better. But that PHP portal is meant to complement and eventually get hardened enough to be an actual production instance of human services data API.
Awesome. So we've linked this in a couple different places. Folks, please be sure to check this out. If you have questions or suggestions about how this can be useful, please let us know. We've already used it in the Miami Open 2.1 implementation. This essentially served as the developer-facing front end for the Miami Open 2.1 API. And we hope that others are able to find it useful as just a way to get your own developer portal up and running. And Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about the playground that you built?
Yeah, right. Okay, so my initial idea was to build something around Kin's OpenAPI specification in the first place, but as soon as I started digging into the project in depth, I found a couple of points that other people wanted someone to tackle, especially the validation side of things. So I decided to create a very simple dashboard-like web application that could act in the long run as a central playground or a central point of reference for people to start understanding and start working with the specification through a set of tools that could be easily plugged into this playground app. So the first tool that I started working with was a validator tool for validating open referral resources against their schema as defined in the official Open Referral specification. So through this first tool, a user could go and have a look at the schema and see what types of resources are supported, and download some sample CSV files containing valid records of this type of resources. And as a next step, to create a data package validator, that someone could just point to a valid data package URL, and the app could, validate these resources against the official Open Referral spec.
Any questions for Kin or Chris about these two tools? You have a portal for developers and also a data validator for people who are trying to get data into the Open Referral spec.
You mentioned it briefly, but I'll elaborate a little bit more on the Airtable.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna paste this in here while you talk.
So it's pretty cool as far as, if you're not familiar with Airtable. Airtable is a software as a service that is kind of a spreadsheet meets database in a kind of attractive web application, and it allows you to basically create a spreadsheet like database, which then immediately lets you deploy a database or a API, excuse me. And so what's his name that created it? I'm sorry, I forget his name.
This is from Devin.
Devin. So Devin's created a human services implementation, basically creating replicating the schema as a set of Airtables, and then which immediately launches an API. So to date, it's pretty much the quickest way you could launch HSD compliant API that I've seen. It's pretty cool, but it's another example of how people are playing around. I'll add, I'm also playing around with a couple similar versions, not using Airtable, but using just strictly Google Sheets and GitHub Pages. Another kind of free example or low cost example of how you could deploy an API. It's not anywhere near production ready, but it's an interesting prototype for how people can play with small human services data implementations and just show the possibilities. I would also like to add, I'm going to publish the page in the chat to my kind of landing page. When I explain what I'm doing with Open Referral, this has kind of all my work on it, and including these projects. We're also in addition to working on the PHP prototype that runs on Amazon, supporting the Ohana implementation, which tends to run on Heroku. We're also pushing forward conversations as far as a Google implementation, so human services that runs on the Google platform using Google Cloud services. We're also pushing forward with an Azure running on the Microsoft platform. And so we basically have kind of an active project for every major cloud platform out there, as well as we're starting to diversify in the number of languages that we're having supporting API implementations for human services. And it's getting pretty interesting what people are doing with it.
Cool. I would love to hear if folks, we don't have to take too much time now, if you have needs, tools that would be useful for you to work with this data, to try to get data into this format, to work with it, to display it to other folks. What we have here, the Airtable, I found is already a very useful tool for actually just working with the data and showing it to folks who might not know how to like do scripts and so on. But I suspect that there are more uses out there that we could potentially develop some tools libraries to help you all with. So you should start putting it on our agenda. Unless there are any questions, I think we could jump right into some of the issues. Cool. So Kin, why don't you give us a quick overview of version 1.1 of the specification. And I know that Adafe actually did an in-depth peer review of the spec, so I want to get some feedback from her. And then we'll kick it. I want to hear if other folks have issues, questions about version 1.1 of the spec, and hopefully we'll have some time shortly after the hour to talk about what's on the agenda for version 1.2.
Yeah, so I'll kind of run through kind of what's on the table right now, and then I'll hand it over to Adafe to augment with her her feedback and review, but also she's got some a tool that's going to help the community provide feedback as well, which I think is super important here, or is a critical part of this moving forward, and the draft getting released and us moving towards a 1.2 version. So let me see.
I'm going to share that tool in the chat bar right now, actually.
Okay, that'd be cool.
Feedback collection form.
So I'm going to share my screen here, if it will let me. And I'm going to, I don't use Google Slides very much, so how do you get to present mode? There we are. Can you see my screen? Just a blank Human Services Data API.
Yep.
All right. So, so this is basically we're at the draft version of the Human Services API, which I articulated a little bit ago. Is has the constraint of a 1.0 version, which is basically the HANA implementation. So my goal is really to bring things together and try to merge the 1.0 Ohana with the 1.1 data schema, and try to create a next iteration without moving too fast before I started learning more about the community and what's going on, but getting feedback from vendors and implementers and y'all here that are on the call. So that's pretty much where we're at right now. But what I've done to move forward the conversation, if you're not familiar, I'm going to touch on Open API just a little bit, but Open API, which was formerly known as Swagger, is a way of describing the surface area of an API, which describes where the path is available, all the different paths, contacts, organizations, locations, as well as all the detail, what parameters are required. And the Open API started as a kind of open source specification language for describing all APIs, not just human services, in 2011. And then by 2016, it was put into the Linux Foundation. And I'm one of the members of the Linux Foundation and the Open API initiative, which helps move forward the specification itself. And it's an Uber specification, so it can, I'm also helping use Open API to describe healthcare specifications, banking specifications. We're going to be working with Open 3.1.1 to create an Open API for 3.1.1 specification, as well as Open Referral Human Services. So Open API is a way that all APIs are being defined. It's just one of several formats like this, but it is the leading format out there, and it's being adopted by Microsoft, IBM, Google, Amazon, all the major players. And so what this gives us is a way of defining all the nitty-gritty detail of the specification, and it's going to provide us with the blueprint for how we ultimately say, an API is human services compliant or not, or partially compliant. So what I've done is move the API towards a version 1.1, which honestly didn't have really was about making sure the entire schema was covered, basically as many aspects of the data specification could be represented in this API and accessible somewhere on the surface area of 1.1. I really didn't want to take too much liberty in shifting the landscape or making any breaking changes, because we're at a 1.1. We're not at a major revision, and like I said, I really need to get a lot more community feedback before I make too many decisions. And so I'm going to walk through kind of what all those decisions are that are on the table right now as we sit with this draft. And where I stand right now is I'm happy with this draft. moving forward as it is, but I'm also more than happy to quickly move towards a 1.2 to satisfy some of these concerns that are on the table, because I think they're pretty important concerns, but I want to get wider feedback on them. One of the areas that I kind of dodged with this release is any sort of guidance on how you version your API, meaning I'm versioning the specification. We're at version 1.1 of the specification, but I don't provide any guidance for implementations to articulate whether they're, what version of their API they're at and how that API is compliant with this version of the Human Services Data API specification. So I'm kind of purposely dodging that question because it's a tough question, and I want more community feedback, even if I should be providing guidance, because I'm not 100% convinced that we should be providing guidance. But I wanted to put it on the table and talk about it. This whole talk that I'm giving right now is available on API Evangelist on my blog in detail, and there's more resources there to help you understand the implications of versioning, whether we do it in the URL, whether we do it as a header, or whether we don't offer any guidance at all, which I'm leaning towards somewhat. So I'm gonna leave this on the table as an open issue. All of these areas that I'm walking through right now have their own open issue on the GitHub repository for the specification, which allows us to move forward the conversation. So I'm gonna just leave this one open, and you're welcome to comment. It's not something that I feel needs to be in 1.1, but we can talk about it for future versions. The next area that I feel the API definition for version 1.1 provides guidance on is just really naming of the paths. We have the core resource paths, contacts, locations, organizations, services, but it then takes the schemas and helps articulate how we name sub-resources. But ultimately, I would like to turn this into overall design, API design guidance that I can use and Greg and I can use as far as naming other future API paths that we add in here, things around metadata or around the taxonomy. And so really just trying to keep paths as simple and clean and intuitive as possible. This version really focused on making sure as much of the surface area of the schema was represented, but as much of the surface area was read-writable. So basically using our verbs, allowing not just get data, but also be able to post, put, and delete data, or add, update, and delete data. Now I won't stop there. There's a handful of other verbs that we might want to consider and have an open conversation about, but nothing that impacts version 1.1. But we might want to consider the implications of using patch and allowing partial updates to resources, as well as I'd like to start thinking about how we offer options guidance, which is a verb for providing information on the surface area of the API and the server behind. So this is an open conversation. Right now, I'm pretty comfortable that all the surface area of the API or the surface area of the schema covered by the API is readable as well as writable, which I think is super important. One thing I want to put out there is how we start thinking about other meaningful actions taken against these resources. I don't have anything on the table right now that would kind of fall into this category, but I want to open up the conversation, open up a thread. I would say the first one that's coming up on the horizon is how we deal with simple or complex representations of each resource. Now, I'm not saying this is the path we should go, but one action might be, hey, I want a full representation of an organization rather than the simple one that comes by default. But that's one aspect on the table. It's not the best API design decision, but it's one that might resonate with the community. So I have an open thread regarding how we handle discussions around these actions from an API design kind of standpoint, and we kind of head these conversations off the pass and make sure they stay as consistent as possible as requests come in for future versions. I want to think deeply about parameters. There's an open thread on this. Right now, how we use parameters is actually pretty minimal. Really, the core or contacts, organizations, locations, and services have just a handful: query and page num. So query is about filtering of the data that's returned, and then page and page num is how you handle the pagination around those results. The search path has a robust set of fields, parameters that you can filter by. Long and lat, organization name. So it's really the only one that has a number of query parameters, but really across all the paths, it's a pretty blank canvas right now. But I want to be very thoughtful and keep an open conversation about which parameters we add, how we add them, and I want to have a very thoughtful approach to quantifying. Well, how many parameters do we have? How many default values do each parameter has? And how we keep, we avoid bloat and think about whether we want to, grow the specification horizontally and add new paths and new design, endpoints to the surface area, or do we load up in parameters and allow people to vertically kind of work with the resources. Some developers prefer the clean paths. It tends to be intuitive for integrating and working with, while others prefer and are very familiar with working with parameters. So we're gonna have lots of discussions about adding parameters. Another layer of this conversation is how we address headers. Right now, there are no headers included as part of the specification. I leave this open because it layers over several of the other conversations that are going on right now. One of them about how we filter the scope of the schema returned. So if you want a simple versus a complex or a full set of results, one option on the table is to use a prefer header, which would allow developers to say, hey, I want simple or complex representation, and but we're not limited to those types of representations. We could basically create any number of schema sets that could be returned. So I really want to make sure headers is on the table. In my experience as API evangelist, developers tend to be pretty deficient when it comes to understanding how to use headers and their importance in API design. And I want to make sure that we're educating vendors and implementers as well as end developers as much as possible. But I want to be mindful that they are tough for some developers to wrap their head around. And I want to be cautious on how we use them because of that. I want to point out we're using the body specifically for posts and puts. So if you add a new record, organization, location, any of the sub-resources, you're passing that entire JSON as a body as part of that request. And there's really no changes, no deviations from that for this. I just want to have an open issue, an open thread for how we talk about body usage in the future. If we consider patch, we'll have more of these conversations allowing partial updates of resources. But right now, there's nothing impacting version 1.1. I'm just leaving it open. So now we're going to kind of get into the first layer. What caused me to kind of table some of the requests. Basically, I had the whole entire surface area of version 1.1 ready to go. I was diving into organizations, locations, and services, and I was allowing more filtering of data. So basically adding the query, so you could query, and then I started looking at the search parameter and go, well, how well do we want people to be able to query data at search versus at the actual individual endpoints? And I saw there's some open discussions as well as some newer discussions about, well, hey, I'd rather be able to search for organizations at organizations, or I'd rather be able to search at search, which right now, as far as the Ohana spec is concerned, search returns locations. There's discussion around search should return a comprehensive set of collections across organizations, locations, services, and contacts. So that's an open discussion about, is search more of the place where you go to do the data filtering and limiting scope, or do you go to the actual resource itself to do it, or can you do both? And so this is one of the major conversations on the table that I would like to solve moving to 1.2. I kind of put it off in 1.1 and said, hey, we're not going to address it now. We're just going to, get what's there out. But I would like to, have more discussions around whether this is done at search or the individual resource. Now, stepping up one level, that same conversation is how do we limit the scope or allow for filtering of the schema, which also impacts what data is returned, but it's really not about filtering the data. It's about filtering the results, the scope of the results or the schema that's returned. So right now I kept it pretty flat, just returning the base schema. So if you pull up an organization, you just get a flat organization record. If you want to get at the phones, the address, or anything, you have to hit the endpoint to do so, which is cumbersome, adds an extra step. But inversely, if all you care about is just getting the phone number, it's a logical and not extraneous second step. If you want to go from just a listing of organizations to getting the phone number for a single organization in a UI, the current design allows you to do what you need. But for version 1.2, I really want to allow for filtering of the schema, so you as a developer can say, I want the simple representation, which is default, or I want a more complex one. And so how we do that, I'm open. Like I said, we have a prefer header where you could pass a header and you could request, specific schemas that we as the platform operators or, human services define. Or we could, approach this in the path by offering, actions that allow you to get complex, simple, more location-based. We could come up with different schemas that make sense. Or we could take a more GraphQL kind of query parameter approach and add a field that lets people, pass in a comma delimited set of that what they would like to see. And so they could pass in phones. If they just wanted the phones, they could pass in physical address or mailing address, and basically kind of play a hand in querying what they would like to receive. And this becomes more of a concern when you're building mobile apps and you need, you have network latency versus, a full-blown web connection where the amount of what gets returned, might not matter. So this is probably the number one issue on the table right now is allowing to get more complete requests at the organization, location, services, and contacts level. And I have opinions on what I would like to see implemented. I really want to hear from the community about what's needed for querying data in different application settings. I would like to extend this to not just Git, but also allowing us to do posts and updates that allow for more robust. So you could submit and add a new contact or a new organization along with all of its addresses, all of its phone numbers, all of its services in a single JSON and hit post, and the system would handle that behind the scenes and do all those inserts into and relationships and whatnot. So this is the data scope and filtering, and this schema scope and filtering are I would say the two biggest items on the table for moving for 1.2. Do
we want to pause there and see if folks have comments while it's still fresh in their heads? And I'm happy to, let's just see if, rather than jumping right into issues, go ahead and share observations or questions. Let's see if we can take a stack if we have multiple, and then go from there.
Okay, since no one else jumped in first, this is Kate,
Yeah.
I'll jump in. And I apologize that I actually didn't even know about the GitHub repository until someone CC'd me onto a specific issue, and then I was like, oh, look at this. So I am way behind in reviewing all of the issue lists and all of that. So I started doing some commenting today and included this. This is a big one for me. Looking at the use cases that I put forward, some of the ones I discussed include things like bulk loading and all of that. And when I look at the structure today, I think I could not efficiently do, you know, X, Y, Z. One of the things that I commented on around sort of the full, partial, or simplified versions of what's returned is it's so complex. You cannot even predefine, well, simple is this fields and complicated is this fields, and this is, you know, based on my experience up to today, every single client has a different opinion on the critical fields that are the minimal set and the full set. They will not agree, absolutely will not agree. If you take the example of the full list of organizations, so the the organizations at the base level, it seems to be returning only accessibility and the ID of the organizations, for example. So like that wouldn't work for me. It wouldn't work under any scenario that I can think of that that's what they would want to be returned. But I also know that if I took 3 different clients, they would completely disagree on what should be returned at that base listing of organizations. And so what I had written in my comment on the issue was we use we have 2 solutions that we do on our system now. One is for the full API where people actually have an API account, they pre-configure what they want at various points. Like, this is what I want return in search results. This is what I want when I'm viewing a full record. Like, they have pre-configured in their API account, if you will, what they want returned because they don't agree. And then we have the public sort of mini API where they don't have an account and therefore can't do that configuration. And they send in the common delimited, you know, this is what I want. So there's a default, and it's exactly the kind of thing you were talking about where they can be explicit and list, you know, I want to see in this result set the phone number and the email and the website and whatever. And that's what gets returned. Because I do think you're just going to kill yourself if you try and predetermine what these results should look like, as if it was a fixed thing that people could agree on. It's never going to happen. It's just not. I can't even get 2 clients to agree. Like, never mind infinite clients. I don't think I've ever had 2 agree on the same thing. So.
That said, we do have in the human services data specification, we have already made decisions, at least for Open Referral's opinion, as to what's required and what's recommended and then what's optional.
But so I'm talking about, let's say you do a search result. Like, what fields are going to show there before you go and pull up the full record details, right? Like, what's going to be returned as that base request where I'm just want to list the organizations before they click in and get more details, right? There's degrees at which you're asking for information and where you're asking it for a specific organization where you probably want more details versus you're returning a listing of organizations and you want, like, how much do you return at each level? There's different requirements. So it's not about the data structure underlying it, which is obviously based on the schema. It's about what are you displaying at a particular time. And it's you take the mobile application versus the desktop, for example. You have a smaller screen, you have smaller real estate, you cannot necessarily display the same information for both of those scenarios. So you have to have some flexibility about, and also the network issue. That's the thing that immediately I thought I couldn't use the schema as is because I couldn't put that many different requests in order to actually retrieve the information. If I have to first do a request for the organization and then the organization's contacts and then another request for the phone numbers and then another request for the languages and then another request for the addresses, the latency of every one of those requests is going to mean the performance is atrocious. I can see the need to pull those things individually. There are scenarios under which that is important, so I'm not saying get rid of that, but I absolutely think it's critical to a practical implementation that you be able to pull more information in a single request.
And that's where we're at right now.
Yeah.
defining what that should look like. My role as the gatekeeper is trying to defend, every use case and limit, as a database practitioner for 30 years is limit the strong arm DBA coming in and owning the conversation, which ultimately makes the cognitive load for when a new user first lands on the documentation. They have to navigate so much to understand what's going on and how to make a simple first request and start learning about what's going on. So that's precisely this conversation is how do we reduce the cognitive load for new users, we accommodate the many different users, and we allow advanced users to get at and figure out what they need. And this reflects many different design disciplines, many different needs, and it reflects what's a conversation that's going on in the space. Honestly, right now is one of the biggest. We have web APIs, which I would say, the API reflects right now. I would say we have hypermedia APIs, which is very much about the relationships between these objects and sub-objects, and the response would give you those URLs to make those sub requests, those relational requests. So you don't actually have to think about how to build a URL to get the phone number or get these. You just loop through the related links and you get that. And I would say another camp is very much the GraphQL people, who are very much bringing the query language from the back end and putting it in the hands of API developers and letting them precisely say which fields, which arrays and objects should be returned. Give me exactly what I need. And so my role is to try to kind of mitigate between all of these scenarios. And ideally, I would like to have maintain the complex surface area that we have right now, which I'll talk about in the next step a little bit, but also give people as much possible control at a single endpoint while trying to mitigate bloat at each of those endpoints, because I want to keep things very microservices focused and not offer too much bloat, but I want to allow people to quickly say which fields should be included. One thing that I would add as far as the templating and being able to create schemas that could be returned based upon some sort of name like simple or complex, either in the header or in the URL, is a lot of times you don't make those up. You offer a simple and a default simple and a full, and then you give people the ability to filter which fields get returned, and then you operate for a month or two, and you take the logs based upon how people filtered, and you build templates based upon what people are asking, because what people say and what people do tend to be two different things. So I would never build those templates based upon what I think should be there. I would build them based upon how people are using the system. And those in the know can build filters and choose which fields they want. And then the rest can quickly choose from templates and save the cognitive load of having to build their own schema filtering.
Ken, this is Neil. I want to say, first of all, as I commonly do in these conversations, agree 1,000% with everything Kate said. Love it, Kate. Thank you. And Ken, I like that last idea. I've been thinking, why not 3 options? Why not simple? Just give me exactly the object that I asked for. Everything, give me the object and all of its related objects through multiple levels if necessary. And then in between where I can specify which object type I want.
We're getting some sort of printer noise in the background.
Or a vacuum cleaner or something.
Or a vacuum cleaner.
I don't think it's me. So, and then in between where you can specify exactly which object types you like. Ken, I really like that idea of watch the log, see what comes in, build templates. I don't know if that's something you could do in the spec directly, or if that's just something that an API implementer could do on the side. Maybe the spec could accommodate the notion of templates, but yet the templates can be freeform, because we're all going to have different use patterns, and we're all going to gravitate towards clusters of templates, quote unquote, that are meaningful and useful versus those that we think are outliers and don't really want to support. So anyway, like both those ideas, I just wanted to chime in with a big yes.
Yeah, so I think that's where I'm leaning for 1.2. I think 1.2 is basically going to have a simple default and then a full. How you request that full, I'm still kind of on the fence with, whether it's done in the path or in a header or in a parameter. I'm leaning towards path because it makes it easily cached, easily defined in the documentation, and kind of intuitive. So you can go /organization/full. I'm still kind of arguing with myself, and I would love to hear feedback. But really, I'm thinking 1.2 is going to have the simple, which we have now. It's going to have a full, so you get just all of it. And then maybe a parameter that you can pass in a comma-separated list of name, description, latitude, longitude, phones, and it would include all of those. And then the logging conversation, and then identifying future templates. That's going to be built into kind of metadata discussions and kind of how the logging and the API management for this works, which is an added project down the road. So
this is Benj, and I want to so appreciate the laying out of these questions and themes. I think it's it's a great articulation of where we are and what's before us. I think I mostly have a process question, which is to say we're already over the intended time for this meeting. We haven't had a chance to hear Adafe's feedback and review and thoughts. And we have a ton of questions here that we need to think about together. And I guess I'm curious, what's the process and timeline for bringing our voices together, not just to hear about what the questions are, but to actually hash out ideas and think about them together? And related to that, what kind of decision-making process do we have? Is it, whoever is in a meeting comes to consensus, or everyone advise and Kin makes decisions as benevolent dictator, or something more formal? I'm looking ahead and seeing that there's a ton to work out here, and a lot of implementers who are eager to start trying things.
Yeah, great questions. So first of all, I did, based on the last time we hurried to cram everything into an hour, I did slot this for an hour and a half for the review of 1.1 and 1.2, and then we have some extra time to discuss additional issues that haven't even been discussed within the spec itself, that some of the folks here brought up about update protocols, that sort of thing. So sorry if that wasn't clear, that we're going well over the hour, first of all. To the question about how we deal with these issues, this is an opportunity for us to get face-to-face, actually look at the spec while we're in real time, surface issues. We are going to be really having these debates substantively in the GitHub issues queue, on the documentation, and so forth. So we're not really depending on this call to answer any hard questions so much as just to hear each other as we sort through what the hard questions are and sort of set the agenda. In terms of how decisions get made, we're aiming for rough consensus at all times. Ken's putting things out based on the feedback that we get. If things don't work for folks, we want to hear about it. And in instances when we can't easily reach rough consensus based on what we're learning from our implementations, we have the ability to actually consult directly with a group of stakeholders. And by the way, I still have $3,000 of our budget from the digital impact funds that we can use to stipend particular stakeholders, presumably subject matter experts. These are people who actually work with the data, resource data specialists. And in instances where we can't reach consensus, we will be bringing it to those stakeholders and getting them to weigh in. That way we'll be able to actually check some of our assumptions from technical developers against the people who actually have to work with the stuff. And does that answer your question, Benj, about process?
A little bit. I think, so appreciate, it sounds like the main conversation place will be GitHub, so we should lean into there.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead.
No, go for it, Ken.
I was going to just answer all your questions. Let me A, blow through my slides here. B, it'll end on kind of, hey, what's next, and how we can communicate and how we can collaboratively make these decisions together. But yes, ultimately there's somewhat of a dictatorship as well, that ultimately I have to kind of make decisions with Greg's alongside Greg. but I want to quickly get to Dafe's work because that helps, I think.
Yeah, let's go for it. Thank you.
So schema scope filtering, data scope filtering, definitely the top two areas I want to satisfy with 1.2. So don't fret with 1.1. It definitely just kind of, it was all I had the time for, basically, to be honest. I couldn't move everything forward. The next area I want to really help you understand, emphasize, is path and scope filtering. That we're not only, you know, there's a lot of concern around the number of resource paths available. In my mind, when you land on the documentation page, you should see /organization, /location, /services, /contacts, and /search. You shouldn't see anything else. And we're gonna be adding in metadata. We're gonna be adding in taxonomy and probably a whole bunch of other endpoints. We're gonna have to come up with an efficient way in the documentation and in the specification how we limit by path, how we group, and we allow people to filter and get at that. So if you're a new user, you're not burdened. If you're an advanced user, you can still get at what you need. This also feeds into how we're going to be layering in these new projects. You know, I don't anticipate every new project's going to, hey, we're moving forward the core specification because of this side project. I want to quickly come up with a way how we move forward taxonomy work, how we move forward metadata or approval and feedback without it freaking everybody out about the core spec. So we're going to have to come up with a way of scoping and filtering projects, which trickle down to paths, which trickle down to the schema, which trickle down to what data is available. So those are kind of the top 4 areas of that that I will be addressing moving to 1.2. Pagination is another concern. Right now we have page and page num. As we evolve the response structure, and pagination is going to have to evolve. This is going to have to play an important role in that scope conversation we just had. Sorting as well. Sorting right now, we really there is no guidance. There's some basic level sort guidance in the search, but really there are no mechanisms to sort otherwise. And we need to come up with a strategy. This doesn't have to be 1.2. It could be a 1.3 or 1.4 item, but we need to think about it. But all of this feeds into the overall response structure conversation, which isn't just about, you know, min and max and schema filtering. It's about also about potentially introducing a hypermedia into the conversations. If you're not familiar, providing links and relationships and more structure to the responses, which once we bring in the taxonomy conversations, really could provide some opportunity for meaningful results to be returned as part of searches. And I don't, actually I want to jump forward. I should have put this slide after. This conversation should also include content type negotiation. Right now, the version 1.1 returns just JSON. In my mind, you should also be able to negotiate a CSV representation as well as a text HTML representation. By default, I think these all 3 should be available. If we think about adding in hypermedia, you know, the introduction of a HAL or a JSON API representation, that development could continue right alongside the core specification, the default JSON, because of content type negotiation. Meaning, when you make a request, you can say, I want specifically, you know, HAL, or I want specifically. We could eventually come up with our own human services data API media type that is a pretty robust JSON representation. Or we could, you know, choose the hypermedia, as I said. So content type negotiation is going to become an important part of how we design the API and provide it and navigate it and handle complexity and potentially versioning. So I need, you know, I want to help everyone on board with this and make sure that it's part of the conversation. Another project that's on the table for probably 1.3, I would guess, is when we're gonna have time for it, is how does the specification provide guidance on handling of status codes and returning of errors. And I wanna have a whole set of schema eventually that articulates error codes so that developers get common sets of errors returned that leverage HTTP and actually use status codes. And then with that said, in conclusion, there's several other projects that are on the table. I pushed off the taxonomy part of the schema and the metadata part of the schema because I think when we're crafting these APIs, they can't just be CRUD, post, put, delete representations of the schema. We need a lot more thought put into both those areas. And then along the way, approval, feedback, universal IDs, and kind of a messaging system, and then webhooks, making the system a little bit more evented and kind of real time. So these projects are on the table. We're gonna maybe, if we have time, we're gonna talk about them. But I really encourage you, go to the portal that we have. It's a demo. It should be working. If it's not, let me know so we can keep it up to snuff and keep it a representation of the specification. And then, yes, this is primarily being hammered out as the GitHub issues, but similar to the complexity of the API, I know GitHub issues has its own kind of cognitive load as far as working with some people. So join in on Slack, join in on Google Group. I'm doing my best, time allowing, to aggregate things from Slack and Google Group and keep the central set of issues as on GitHub. But really, it's about communicating, and I would throw in there, I don't have it on the slide, but I would be open to doing like open office hours, like on Thursdays or Fridays, where we have an hour or two where we can do this call, but in a less formal format and talk through all these issues. And if people can make it, great. If they can't. But with that said, the GitHub issues, the primary one, you can find me on Twitter and where else. And I'd like to hand it over to Dafe to talk about, her perspective of the peer review of it, as well as how to kind of facilitate your feedback.
Thanks, Ken.
Hopefully I blew through it fast enough there.
If folks have questions or comments, please do formulate them in the document or in the chat column while we hear from Dafe.
I'm just going to share my screen, and should be shared now. Hopefully you can see an open referral, very large open referral logo. Just someone want to confirm you can see that? Great.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, so our point of view at Open Data Services is to keep alignment between the API and the HSDS standard. So we've had experience with the 1.0 was that there was significant diversion between the API and the standard, which meant that there were things happening in the API that didn't make sense if you were using the standard and vice versa. So my focus is very much on coming back to basics and much higher level questions around, is there alignment between these two objects? Is the API and this schema actually, are they speaking the same language? And looking at what can you do with the API. It's not as detailed as some of the questions that Ken's been diving into. It's very much from the management of the relationship between the two. So I will just go through some of our thinking. So a short history of what's happened so far is that in a bit of this has been touched by Greg, so I won't spend too much time on it. So 14.15, Ohana and HSDS were developed in parallel, but there was no direct compatibility, which I've already touched on, was that you kind of could use the Ohana API, but it wasn't really supporting HSDS fully. So that's quite an important thing, is that support is there and it's maintained, and that's the basis of my peer review. So in 2017, there's been an explosion of new things happening, as everyone's seen. We've released 1.1 of HSDS, and Ken has started on the OpenAPI spec. And again, we're keeping the focus on ensuring that they were aligned. So comparison between the two, HSDS, both the spec and HSDS in version 1.1 And you have to remember that HSDS is a standard that tells you what to publish and how to publish it, and what the relationship between this information is going to be. It's a stable version. It has a very slow revision process, because what we find with supporting multiple data standards is that what you don't want to do is to jump in and start making changes, because everyone who's implementing it is going to be affected by those changes, especially if they're breaking changes. So changes have to be thoughtfully applied. So version 1.1 is for the foreseeable future stable, and there's a governance process attached to how that will be updated. And when we look at the API, that's now in version 1.1, and that is talking about how do you fetch the information and how do you interact with the information. So it's a very different perspective, but obviously we still want to make sure that the two are tightly coupled, so that you are, if you're using the API, you are using HSDS, and it doesn't end up with the diversion that we saw before. So unlike the standard, there is more scope for the API to make changes, and it's great that Kim's talked about all the changes that we're looking at making. So what did we find in the review? So in the review, we found that there was direct access to all the tables in HSDS. So you've got your organization, services, phones, contacts. We were looking, does the API cover all of those? Does it allow you to access those? And we found there was nested access to organization, services, and locations. I've got a little diagram down at the bottom of the screen. That's my understanding of how the API, how you can access, or the path through which you can access data, HSDS data, using the API of version 1.1. Now, I'm just going to quickly touch on that. So through the organization, you can access everything, but some services, some information, for example, services are nested under programs. So you can go through programs to get your services, and similarly, you can go through services to get your contacts, or you can get your contacts directly at the organization level. So it's worth having a look at that. That diagram. It's in the feedback form, and having a look and seeing if you agree, disagree with how that information structure is put together. And then that brought us to a few questions about what would you like to see as your highest priority endpoints? And I know that there's been a discussion already about what priorities are and how difficult they are, so I appreciate that, and I'll make sure that that goes into the feedback form and is represented in the data capture we do there. And also there's another question around which methods are going to be easy to use, which methods are going to be difficult to use, which are going to be easy to provide, which are going to be difficult to provide. So taking a pragmatic approach to the weighing of the difference between having a very strict and structured way of doing things versus infinite flexibility, which both create their own problems. So the feedback forms will be coming out to you. There's a link in the document, but we are still making some changes. So what will happen is through Greg, next week, I will share a copy of the feedback form, which you can then use for commenting. But it's fine to take a look at what's there now. Just be aware that we are still making some changes to make that more useful. So what kind of feedback are we looking for from you? We appreciate that you all have different perspectives. You're all at different stages and have different use cases. But we are looking at lining up the documentation, the API spec. That's the critical thing. And what we found was that in the documentation that's attached to the API, there wasn't a very good correlation between what was in the spec and what was the documentation, which I think is just a case of rerunning this. So this is what I found in there. I also found that some differences in the names, in the object names between the two. So organization versus organizations, and then little pedantic details like where the underscore to the dash is. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but we're thinking about, we're constantly thinking about that alignment. Does it mean the same thing if you're using the HSD specification directly and you're talking about an organization and using the API and you're talking about organizations, and that can actually cause problems down the line. So we're trying to get those sorts of things kind of bottomed out. And then we also looked at improving the information on search parameters. So that's kind of where I think probably the most interest is going to be from the discussion we had earlier, was that for us, we thought there needed to be more information on how do you use these search parameters, so that if you're reviewing it in future, you can say, okay, this doesn't allow me to do what I want. So it was around those three things. Those are three major pieces of feedback that we gave to Kin, and we would like to understand if you find the same things when you review it, or if you have any other issues that crop up that you would like to see. Bearing in mind that, as I said, our focus really is on keeping that alignment and making sure we don't get a repeat of the Ohana situation. So, I know I'm racing through this, but there'll be time for a few questions. This is just a preview of the feedback form where we're describing the functionality that we've seen in the API and then soliciting your feedback, depending on if you're going to be consuming the data or publishing the data using the API. We may end up changing those two users. But right now, those are the two users, kind of very broad users that we've selected, who hopefully should fit everyone on this call and anyone we include in the feedback in future. And looking at the different features. So one of the things, some of the feedback I got on the form is that it still needs a little bit more of a story through what's going on, because right now it's very much telling you the functionality of the API, but it's probably not as useful to help you kind of understand what's going on with the API and how that would affect you. So we're going to be making some tweaks to make that a little bit more useful, so that you can provide more specific feedback. So that might be changing a little bit, but that's just a quick preview of what that form is going to look like. So we will ask for some feedback, and I'll let you know the date we would like the feedback back by, but it will be out next week. And that's going to help us prioritize what's needed for 1.2. So we're not just going to be asking you what do you think about the API right now. We're going to also be asking what's missing, what do you need, what's the priority items for you that you need. We'd like some volunteers to pilot version 1.2. So again, I know that people on this call will probably be quite happy to do that. It'd be nice to involve people who maybe not here, to just ensure that we get a nice breadth of users of HSDS, and that will involve dry runs, running some code to test our assumptions, so we're not putting features in. As Kin said, there's quite a few things he could add, but it's about making sure those are practical and useful in real life scenarios that we can hopefully write up as examples and use cases, rather than jumping straight into adding extra features that people don't need. So I'm going to pause there. So I know that's been very quick, and take any questions that you might have on what's going on right now and the feedback that we'll be sending out next week.
If folks have questions, if anybody wants to jump in or leave your question in the chat box, and I will call on you.
If no one's speaking up, it's Kate. I'll speak up. I love to speak up, obviously. So I'm not doing, I think everyone knows, I'm not doing an actual implementation. I'm just here because I have a big mouth, apparently. So what I would like to see is those kinds of use cases that I talked about, and I'm coming back to that again. I would really like to see a walkthrough of those, saying, if I was implementing this need, how does the API meet my need? And if I did that today, for most of the use cases that I presented, the answer would be no. And so that tells me that something's wrong. Take the integrator need. That is a case where you need to be able to get data in bulk. You need to be able to get it efficiently. You need to be able to query on very specific things to determine whether your data set is correct, what I call sanity checks, where you can say, is the data that I currently have complete and accurate? And like all of that is missing. And I could say that the same thing about most of those. So if I had a client come to me today, and I understand this is absolutely the beginning of where you are now, and that's where it should be. But moving to the next step, where you're trying to get to the point where you have a real-world implementation, you need to be able to walk through these scenarios and say, I could efficiently develop an application that was performant and met all of these requirements so that this client would leave happy and it did what they needed. And I'm worried that some of the really heavy detail, like the status codes or whatever, it's way too easy to run off on that. It's not that it's not important. It's that there's so many more important, more critical things that are needed for a practical implementation. And I would like to see a little more laser focus on let's take a real scenario. This is a client. This is what the client needs. And even though I'm not, as I say, doing an active implementation, I absolutely have client scenarios that I can give you and say, if this existing client scenario that I have, if I wanted to complete this scenario using the API, this is what I would need. This is what you have already, and this is what is missing. That could help focus next steps and not spend very, very precious time on things that are maybe less important to getting a working application.
Absolutely, I agree, which is why, as I said earlier, that we will emphasize putting some more use cases because we have the data consumer and data publisher, which are very wide. So what I need to do next week is look for how can I efficiently design the feedback form to capture the sort of scenario you're talking about without restricting people to a set list of scenarios. So I'm going to have a think about that and look at how I can do that. I've had something thinking around having a part of the form where you can describe your use case and then be able to provide feedback based on that use case. I'm assuming that not everyone's going to have multiple use cases that they want to talk about, or so many that filling in multiple forms is going to be a burden. So that's kind of my assumption, which might be wrong, but be useful to just know if that's the case, if most people have one or two scenarios that they would like to provide feedback on, or if people actually find that in reality, I've got 6, 7, 8, and if I had to fill in 8 feedback forms, that would just be too much. So it's just trying to design it in a way that allows you to express all the really important information you've just shared on this call in as efficient a way as possible, but also being able to collect the scenarios that we haven't thought about, because I'm sure there are people out there who have scenarios that we haven't pre-represented. I don't want to send a form that says you have to be in one of these boxes. So I would love to hear if anyone what are you? I know Kate has quite a few, but from the rest of you, how many use cases in general are you going to try and represent using the API?
And I'd also add, like I said before, we have a modest amount of funding that can support people to actually take the time to go through a test. And I have not yet formalized how that funding is going to be used. That's sitting in Ayers' coffers, and so it'll be a conversation. But if a little bit of resources will help Kate, help you actually take the extra time to go through it, to take one of your implementations and turn it into a test of the spec, I'd like to explore that.
Okay.
Anybody, so other folks, to get back to Dafe's point, I want to hear from other folks on the call based on what you've heard so far. Your open questions and suggestions for us for how to structure this process based on what you've heard so far, and any thoughts about next steps about how you might specifically test it, even while, you know, you've gotten a sneak preview of the form, but we'd really like your feedback. And we're going to work towards closing this call down over the next few minutes.
I'd like to add just a couple notes on top of Adafy's just to close up is one project that I don't have on as a slide on the list that is basically what I'm working on right now is the schema validation. So a JSON schema for HSDS, the schema for HSDA, which is the API definition, and then an API that allows you to run it and basically say what that API returned is a valid HSDS schema. And so that is my tooling for helping me keep the interface in alignment with the schema. So if you have more questions about that, let me know. That's what's being worked on currently. Secondarily, I would say as far as the, one key difference in what Adafy articulated is that we're taking the schema and we're transporting it on the web now. So some of the nuances between the dashes and the underscores are purely RFCs for how things are transported over the web. So you don't use underscores in path names for the web, but you do for objects that are returned. And when you're working with collections over the web, you work with plural. And then when you return it, you return the schema and you adhere to the schema. So there's some web specific articulations in there, but I definitely want to hear how we keep that in sync between HSDS and HSDA as we're trying to articulate and come up with some sort of branding. But as far as the use cases, so one big distinction here that I struggle with flipping back and forth is we're not creating an API definition for a single implementation, which we do APIs. The classic API evolution is we take a database, we publish a set of endpoints that often look just like tables and fields, a very CRUD API, and then we operate an API and we version it based upon use cases, how people are actually using it. I don't have that. I don't have an implementation. That's why I created the demo. And I've yet to see one use case step up that walks through and says, hey, this is what I need as this type of application. So as soon as I get those, I'm happy to hammer them against the current demo for anyone, or if anybody's wanting to do it on their own. And I think those are the most important things that we could have, because as an individual API implementation, I would have those. But as an industry level API implementation, I don't have that luxury. So yeah. let me have them.
Ken, and you probably know this. This is more for others on the call, but the CRUD model is in a good way the lowest common denominator. It's the most useful and utility oriented, but other models like mobile app where you don't really want the normalized full database schema, you want kind of a view model that's more reflective of what you're going to put on screen. They can just bind right up with the controls, or the other use cases we've talked about, which are more involved synchronization of databases together. Those are deviants, if you will, from the lowest common denominator, but those can all be made to work with the CRUD model, which is why I like the way the spec is currently going with some modification.
Yeah, but we need a robust list of all these types of implementations, and honestly, I need them with specific paths and specific schema needs associated with each step, and I'll help articulate that. But when someone provides a description, hey, this person wants this, that doesn't do me much good. I need to know, well, they need organizations. They're going to need organizations to do X in an interface. They're going to need, and then I can say, well, here's what's limiting in the spec, and here's what we can put into the next based upon that use case. And so we need to hammer on it with those is where we're at right now.
So I think, as I hear that and I think about kind of high level general next steps and specific next steps, at a high level, I think like there are a million questions to explore here. And Kate, I appreciated your perspective. Like there's some prioritization here. There's some of these questions that have really major implications for what our use cases look like, and some, like error codes, to use your example, which are good to have polished and right and definitely make a difference, but don't shape as much. And then I think for me, it would be helpful if either as a shared project or Kin, if you could take a lead on prioritizing those, and even just in Slack saying like, hey folks, here are the top 3 GitHub issues for the most pressing questions we're going to focus on for the next 2 weeks. Can people put your attention here? Because right now with 40 GitHub issues on a variety of questions, it's hard for all of us to marshal our attention to have meaningful conversations on those at the same time. So wanted to offer that as one specific suggestion. And
could we add some tags, some new tags to the GitHub issue that help with the prioritization?
Yes.
Great suggestions.
And I think that's what I was waiting for out of this conversation is I prioritize 16, and out of that I have a secondary priority, but I really wanted to get the community's feedback before I actually reflected that on the list on the README page. So that's exactly what needs to happen next.
Awesome, yeah. So do that, and we can look in GitHub, and you can post to Slack so we know where to put attention. And I think on specific use cases, I'll speak for myself. I think there are probably some other folks on the call. We have those use cases and are, reaching out and able to work on them. I think we need to figure out what's the right way to move forward with that. And Greg, I know you're thinking about that also. And I think made a little complex because, a lot of us who want to lean in have our existing implementations. And so, and have a lot, aren't able to necessarily jump over to doing everything in another space, but want to be working with you towards solving some of these problems in a real case. And so, I don't know if that's putting together like a little subgroup around specific implementation projects or specific use case, but I think we can actually move to having the tactical level questions like you're asking for, Ken. I'm not sure we can do it in a documentation mode where we send you, here's the list of 15 endpoints that we need and what the structure for those would be. I think we probably need something that's a little bit more co-creative than that.
Well, as far as, the use cases, you guys, get them to me in any format you can. I mean, submit them as GitHub issues, share them as Google Docs. Let's come up with a meeting where we can talk through them. And then I'm happy to take the ownership of hammering them against the API and seeing where they fall short or where they excel with the current design. But I'm going to put the ownership on you guys to provide me with the use cases. And then I'll take it from there. One quick note on some of the other issues in the prioritization, again, I'm not working on an individual API implementation. I'm working on an industry level and looking across the APIs that are in use. I have yet to come across a single human services API that would work at scale. And what I mean is I've done API implementations across 300 federal agencies for the White House. And if you can't return a proper content type or a proper status code, it'll never scale, it'll never federate, when I'm working with 100 APIs or 300 APIs in a single piece of code and trying to aggregate this at an industry level and create interoperability between providers, we're going to need status codes. We're going to need some of these things. So, when you're down in the weeds as an implementer, headers, status codes tend to always get shuffled aside because they're like, hey, I know what's going on, I understand. But when you're talking at scale, and I'm at scale, I'm at the industry level, I'm going to make sure we're having these conversations, honestly, whether you guys like it or not.
I don't think anyone disagrees with you, Ken, on the importance. It's just a question of what order do we tackle the questions now.
Exactly. And I'm going to help prioritize that. And I think that's the next step as far as the GitHub issues. I agree that README page is way too long because honestly, I jumped into it yesterday in preparation for this call. I hadn't looked at it in a few days. I'm like, whoa, this is way too overwhelming. So I agree 100%.
So I'd like to follow up with folks specifically to see how we can actually shape up some functional use cases that that can generate some really actionable feedback based on real world implementations, or at least like test run implementations. And again, we've reserved some funding specifically for that purpose, and we haven't yet determined how we're going to structure it. So I want to hear your ideas and your questions, and we can follow up over email or in the Slack channel. I want to bring us to a close. Structuring these conversations I find to be really challenging because I want to give us the opportunity to talk through things that maybe just got buried under email, and also we want to be able to deliberate on issues that in ways that are sort of hard on a GitHub thread. I would like your feedback on how to make these assemblies more better structured in the future. For example, I think already I'm seeing the potential to sort of surface issues and weight them in advance over discussions that we can come in knowing specifically what it is that we want to spend our time face-to-face talking about rather than dealing with the whole array. So please, if you have final thoughts, open questions, suggestions for next steps, I want to take some time for folks to chime in right now as we close up. Anyone?
I want to impose and suggest the open office hours thing. I'm willing to, commit to, an hour every other week or every week. I really want some like free form sessions with Kate, and because she's got like every time I jump on the call with her, she's got all of this, and we need to keep that going. But
okay, I'm glad I'm not annoying you. That's good to know. Okay,
not at all. Like really, your use case and scenarios, like. I need it. So we need that in open office hours, I think, in a kind of a free form. And the use cases, I think that's the most valuable thing to come out of this call. So
yeah, I'm glad to sit through with you and actually show you real world what is happening with our data moving around today, if you think that would be helpful. Because when I look at this project and I think, what would I consider success? I would like to be able to replace most of the ways that we interact with what I consider third parties, so that's clients to my clients. If I could substitute or put open referral in the middle of all of those, I would think that shows flexibility and success of the format and the API. I would love to be able to do the majority of scenarios that way, because I think everybody talking the same language there would be an amazing step forward for, I think, the community in general. So that's, when I'm evaluating it, that's what I always have in my mind, is how could I take all of my current scenarios of third-party interaction and make it happen with this format or with this API.
What I would like to see over the next year, y'all, is take those use case scenarios, take that implementation experience that UK and others bring to the table, and hammer on 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and get towards a 2.0 that goes beyond just vendor needs. It's actually hitting on those implementation needs. That's what I would like the next year to hold.
Any other final thoughts?
Greg,
cool.
This is John.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to weigh in that I liked your idea of floating some topics ahead of time and sort of triaging what is going to be the most important in people's minds to cover. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Cool. So we've got some takeaways on our end. First of all, we're going to add new tags to the GitHub repo to start prioritizing and sorting different kinds of issues. We're also going to use that as a tool to structure the conversation of our next assembly, which very well may be in August. And we're also going to set up office hours on Slack for Kin to be able to just sit there in real time and work with y'all. And I'm going to hopefully follow up with some of you specifically to think through how we can support you taking the time to actually run some tests potentially. All right. Any final thoughts? I really appreciate y'all bearing with us through this. This is there's a lot going on here. We took a long time, and I do think we came away with some good direction for the next iteration. And I would welcome any feedback offline, and hope to be seeing your faces again next month.
Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thanks.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
Bye.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.